And somebody like Hugo Chavez comes in and is attractive to the people because he's talking that populist message of, I'm going to stick up for you and we're going to go for the worker. That is not true of Maduro. This guy is a thuggish criminal who is just siphoning what he can.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm John Fowler, the CEO and co-founder of International Intrigue, former diplomat in Beijing and Shanghai. With me as always is Jacob Shapiro, who's the director of Geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Jacob, how are you this week?
Every time you describe yourself as a diplomat, John, I want to describe myself as Rick describes himself in Casablanca, as a drunkard, which makes him a citizen of the world.
Well, there you go. I mean, I feel like diplomat and drunkard are not mutually exclusive. In fact, mutually inclusive. But there we are. This week we've got two big topics to cover. We're gonna spend a little more time than we usually do on two big topics because it's been a big week. I mean, slow news week in some ways, very unslow, or otherwise known as fast news week in other ways. So what we're going to cover is major protests and an interesting regional reaction to the Venezuelan elections last weekend. Nicolas Maduro claimed victory. Pretty clear he didn't win. And then secondly, we're going to chat about all the things that are going on in the Middle East right now. I mean, that could be an hour's conversation on its own. But shall we dive in?
Let's dive in, John. And first is Venezuela. I think people know that Venezuela held elections last Sunday. The country's electoral authority announced shortly after the elections that incumbent President Nicolas Maduro won 51.2% of the vote. Now, the Venezuelan opposition says that it thinks it secured 73.2% of the vote and that it has the receipts to back it up. Venezuela has not released the vote tally sheets from the election, which is technically required by law, although Maduro did promise on Wednesday that he was going to produce the tally sheets, and he also called for Venezuela's highest court to conduct an audit of the election. By the way, that sounds like me. I'm conducting an audit of my daughter's bedtime. It's like the same thing. Who's going to decide in the end? But I digress. Protests have spread throughout Venezuela, and Maduro has deployed the National Guard to suppress them. We've seen videos on social media of clashes there. Any hope that the military and other security forces might turn against Maduro evaporated on Tuesday when the defense minister said, and I'll quote him here, "There is a coup in progress, so President Maduro has stepped up to stop it again, and with him the people who elected him president, all the institutions, the Bolivarian armed forces, and the democratic institutions. We will defeat this coup." John, it's shades of the Arab Spring to me, except maybe even less effectual. I wonder what you think of what's happening on the ground in Venezuela right now.
Well, I think the top line is that it's the most predictable thing ever. I think everybody knew that the opposition were going to be more popular in that election. I think maybe if there was some surprise that it's that they were allowed to vote in that way, that they actually got to the polls, and there's enough evidence that the exit polls suggest that, as you said, the opposition won by quite a lot. But, you know, there was no way Maduro was going to go like, oh, well, that's it for me, off I go. I think the broader context here is it gave me a chance just to kind of have a bit of a closer look at Venezuela, where it's come from, what it used to be, and what Chavez and Maduro have managed to do to one of Latin America's richest countries not that long ago. And it's a really sad story. What let's just call them two dictators in pursuit of their own glory and their own power have ruined a country that was really a jewel of that region. But you know, geopolitically, I'm not particularly surprised what's happened. And I don't expect anything to happen. He will, this has happened before, right? It happened at the last election. I'm using that phrase very, very loosely. And the international community, I think, made a pretty big push at getting rid of Maduro. They failed. He's clung to power. So, I don't see any change coming down the pike anytime soon.
Yeah, trying to interpret this, it makes you feel like magical realism from Marquez. Like all of these countries just seem to repeat their pathologies in the same way. And I also struggle with this with Venezuela because I don't want to say that it's all colonialism's fault, because I think that is an over-exaggeration. But I do think there is a heritage of colonialism here. If you go back 100 years to the history of Venezuela, it's the British that were running around this part of the world. And it was the United States that stepped in and said, hey, this is our backyard. British, you go away. We're going to divide things the way that we want. And there's been sort of these punctuated interventions over time. which prevents strong institutions from growing and prevents institutions from weathering storms. And that really is the story of Venezuela. As you said, they were one of the richest, most successful countries in Latin America as recently as the 1980s. And somebody like Hugo Chavez comes in and is attractive to the people because he's talking that populist message of, I'm going to stick up for you and we're going to go for the worker. And there's hyperinflation and it's the fault of these guys who are, raping and pillaging the country and things like that. And that's the other part of this. Chavez, he really lost his mind as it continued on. But at his core, he was that sort of charismatic populist leader who had a vision of supporting the Venezuelan worker. He went off the rails there, but that was at least where it started. There was some bit of nobility in the ideology. That is not true of Maduro. This guy is a thuggish criminal who is just siphoning what he can off of the country. And I think you're exactly right. It was surprising that he let things go as far as they will, but it's not even going to get to sort of an Arab Spring type situation in Egypt, because when Mubarak got to this point, okay, the military said, you exit stage right, we'll put in some new crony stage left, things go on. The military is not even going to do that. The one hope I had here was going into the elections. The defense minister was a little vague. He was like, oh, we should respect the results of the elections, and whoever loses should pack up and go home. And I think analysts like me, if you had any optimism at all, it was, wow, he's telling you that even the armed forces are sick of Maduro. But the unfortunate thing here is that they're not sick of them. And I think the longer this takes for the protest to gain momentum, the more it plays into the favor of Maduro and the regime and the criminals that are running the country.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And any autocrat worth their salt, with that, the amount of time Maduro's been in power, has managed to kind of put key supporters and allies all through the military, such that the scenario that you're kind of sketching out there is unlikely to happen, because there's too much for folks to lose if they lose their grip on the systems that make Venezuela run, I suppose, or rich, or them individually rich, not the people. But that's a good chance to pivot to the international response to the elections and what's happened this week. So abroad, just to sketch out, the UN, the US, and the EU have all condemned the result, said that it was a stolen election. The opposition won. They've released statements, but they haven't been particularly strident in their language. That's not true of Argentinian President Javier Milei, who came out and called Maduro a fraud and was very, very strong in his language, saying that Maduro should step down and go. And now I saw today Bloomberg is reporting that Venezuela has promised Brazil that it will respect the integrity of the Argentine embassy in Caracas because, and I missed this during the week, Jacob, Maduro has expelled Argentinian diplomats. He's expelled Chilean diplomats too, I believe, or maybe Peruvian diplomats, excuse me. And Brazil has reached an agreement with Argentina and Peru to take care of their embassy while there are no diplomats in town. That we can come to that because that's a interesting development. But as for the LATAM or the Latin American reaction to this, I would say I've been a little surprised that it's been fairly unified. It's differed in strength, but Brazil has come out and said that we're calling for transparency. Brazil, perhaps a more natural partner for the leftist Maduro's regime to work with. Mexico has said the same. AMLO said the same. So there seems to be a universal reaction in LATAM to be skeptical of the result and perhaps trying to work a way to maybe see if Maduro will go into exile or find a solution here where everyone's happy. I don't know how you read the reaction. You're a bit more of a Latin American expert than I am. How did you see it all?
I'm not a Latin American expert, but I did stay at a Holiday
I was trying to big
Express
you up there
last night. No, please. I prefer to be put down. That's just my personality. I think this is really important, and I think there are two levels that we need to think about this from. The first is, and I think you're right. So you've got the West, the G7, sort of in general, not really calling out Maduro directly. It's not like they're saying you got to leave. They're like, we want to see the voter tally sheets. We want transparency, so that they're putting pressure on that score. You're also right that the most strident voices have been from some countries in Latin America. Many Latin American countries are saying, no, this is a fraud. Like, we don't need to see the tally sheets. Like, this is definitely a fraud. The idea that Peru, by the way, is now a beacon of democracy, standing up for democracy, is quite laughable to me, but they were one. Chile was more interesting because Gabriel Boric's government is sort of left, but we're starting to see that that's what left means is really changing in the context of Latin America. And he's been very against Maduro ever since the beginning, even though technically, if you were just thinking, oh, left, that's going to line up, like it doesn't quite line up. But the bigger story here, I think, is that the countries that were not pussyfooting around are China, Russia, Iran, Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
They said, congratulations, President Maduro. And I think that China's powerful enough in the world that, and we've seen this with the Russia-Ukraine war, if China's going to recognize you and China's going to give you a lifeline and China's going to back you, that's maybe enough legitimacy and certainly enough economic incentive for the regime to survive. And the juxtaposition between that clique of nations, which they're not hesitating, they're just saying, yes, we're with Maduro, versus whether it's the Brazilian-led sort of group in Latin America, which is like, we're vetoing things at the Organization of American States, and we're protecting embassies, and we don't like this, but we want the trade. Like, you can just hear the hemming and hawing, and I think that's true in the U.S. and the EU in general. And the last thing I'll just say here is, I'm very bullish on Brazil's future. And one of the reasons I'm bullish is because I think Brazil is the natural hegemon in South America. And this is a wonderful opportunity for Brazil to assert itself as that hegemon. Maybe Lula is reading it better than I am. Maybe he's thinking the long game is how to play this. But if I were in Lula's, briefing room, I would say, you've just been presented with a major opportunity. It doesn't matter if you think that Brazil isn't ready or not for this. You can literally tell the rest of the world to go screw themselves and say, no, this is Latin America. And Latin America will solve its own problems, and Brazil will help Latin America solve its own problems, which in this case is this thuggish criminal who's in charge, who is driving a country into complete ruin. And they're not doing that. They're, should we have a statement with Colombia and Mexico? And, we have to push the resolution over here. And yes, we want transparency. Meanwhile, China and Russia, Iran, all these countries, they're just adding bigger and wealthier countries to their list of countries that are going to resist the diplomatic order that is so dear to you.
I completely agree with you on Brazil being I'm really bullish on it too. But where I might sort of divert from your view there is I wonder if Brazil is being really smart about this. I wonder if they look at Latin America and they say, to take a leadership role, we have to be a builder of bridges here. You've got Gustavo Petro in Colombia, who is pretty left-wing. Boric, as you said, was, it's changing. Who knows what it really means in that part of the world. But certainly on the left side of things, you've got AMLO and then his successor Sheinbaum, who's going to be, presumably fairly similar politically. And then you've got Milei in Argentina, who is completely on the other side and clearly has had difficulties with Brazil in the past. Lula and him have traded words as recently, I think, as earlier this year or late last year. But they're working together on the diplomatic missions in Caracas. So I wonder if Brazil isn't saying, hey, this is an opportunity for us to show the US, to show the rest of the world. Yeah, we're not going to run around and make strident comments like we might have 10, 15, 20 years ago. We are going to deal with this in a way that is, this sounds infantilizing, but a grown-up way. We're going to have conversations. We're going to be consultative. We're going to bring other Latin American voices in and make sure that the solution, if there is a solution, is one that everybody in the region signs on to. Now, maybe I'm being really way too idealistic and they are just kicking the can down the road because they've got bigger problems at home and they're just hopeful that this will all go away. But I kind of read that as, I was thinking about this from the Chinese perspective. Russia and the rest can, they can go jump because they just do things to create chaos. But China has a real vested interest in that part of the world. It's made huge overtures in Mexico. We've talked about that. In Brazil. They really want good relationships in Latin America. And I was confused that they came out so quickly to support Venezuela when I think they could have, that might have pissed off a couple of Latin American countries. I don't know how you see that.
Because it's more important for China that the party line wins. So that if there's an election and somebody declares it, they don't want to open the door to, there was some kind of contested thing where somebody else can come in. And I hear you, but I think the problem with that line of argument, and if I was advising a Brazilian strategist, I would say this to their face, that's not working. So China's already, backing the Maduro regime. This is also the death of whatever Venezuelan democracy was left. And now it's going to be criminal groups and a haven for drug trafficking and arms smuggling and human trafficking and all these other sorts of things. And it's not a small country, in Central America. We're talking about a huge country, geographically wonderfully located, like the type of thing that all these different groups would really, really like. So, like I said, maybe they are wise. Maybe they do want to kick the can down the road. But sometimes the grown-up thing to do is to be a little bit more aggressive. And I don't see that here. I see fear of interference driving Brazil rather than if we could really and maybe that's the American in me. Maybe I should learn that the neocons, it blew up in their face too, and I shouldn't be advising that. But that's
it's
actually
an itch you always want to scratch.
I guess so. No matter how much cortical steroid I put on it, it just doesn't work. Anyway, but that's sort of a good segue if we're talking about generally ineffectual foreign policy to get us into what on earth is going on in the Middle East. And for those who are watching, last week we had a little tiff before we recorded because I was like, oh, we're talking about the Middle East too much. This Netanyahu speech is boring. I don't want to talk about this stuff. It's completely meaningless. And of course, the Middle East turns around and goes, oh, you think we're meaningless? Watch this. We're just going to lay it out for you. So first, we're going to get a rocket from Lebanon that struck a soccer field in a Druze village in the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights. A lot of complexity in there too. What you need to know is that 12 children died, and that the Israeli government blamed Hezbollah. Hezbollah has said it wasn't responsible. I tend to believe that Hezbollah didn't want to do this. Maybe it was a rogue rocket. Maybe it was a rogue faction. Maybe the IRGC is doing weird stuff to try and foment. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to bomb a Druze village and kill children, so I'm sort of there. But that happened, and so you had a lot of back and forth between Israel and Hezbollah about that, and the assassination of one of Hezbollah's commanders in response, and a bunch of missile strikes back and forth. If it had just stopped there, maybe we wouldn't be talking about this. But then on Wednesday, Israel goes and it assassinates the leader of the Hamas political wing, who is in Tehran. So Ismail Haniyeh.
Not to cut in, the New York Times reported today that, and again, this stuff is always to be taken with a grain of salt when it's intelligence activities, but they're reporting that a bomb smuggled into the guest house months ago was remotely triggered when he was staying there. So that's why the details of there were no strikes, there was nothing that showed up on radar. So, but again, that could be disinformation because you never know when it comes to Mossad.
Yeah. Haniyeh was no saint. I mean, but he was also the one leading negotiations. He was the pragmatic leader of the political wing. He wasn't the mastermind of October 7th, but Israel, took out a top Hamas leader because they felt that's what they needed to do. There were two other things, though, that maybe didn't make quite the headlines that those things did, but I thought were just as important. So at the end of last weekend, Turkish President Erdogan made some comments while speaking to his political party, and I'm just going to quote him here. Quote, "We must be very strong so that Israel can't do these ridiculous things to Palestine. Just like we entered Karabakh, so Nagorno-Karabakh, just like we entered Libya, we might do something similar to them. We must be strong so that we can take these steps," end quote. That's the president of Turkey threatening military intervention against Israel to protect Palestine, in case you missed that. And then last but not least, in Israel itself, at the beginning of the week, you had far-right protesters encouraged by ultra-nationalist politicians. They broke into Israeli military bases, and they were fighting with IDF forces. They were looking for jailed Hamas militants to try and beat them up. The IDF managed to shut it down with a relatively small amount of violence, but it was still, I mean, you're sort of watching the deterioration of Israel's society happening, in plain daylight on TV. So there's a lot to break down there, John. Where do you want to start?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the sort of Israeli on Israeli attacks of the military base. I don't have much more to say about that other than remarkable. I couldn't believe it when I read that story. It is really, Netanyahu is really presiding over the fraying of Israel at the moment. But let's go back to the first story you mentioned, which is the assassination of the Hezbollah commander and the attack on the Druze village. I completely agree with you. I can't fathom that this was an intentional rocket attack by Hezbollah on a village to kill children. That does not absolve them of responsibility. I want to be very clear about that. It's, in criminal law, if you walk into a shop and wave a gun around and it goes off, you are equally responsible, even if you didn't mean to. And I think that's the kind of situation here. I think you might ask why that matters. I think it does matter when Israel is calibrating its response. If they have intelligence that they know Hezbollah didn't mean to do this, you start to move into that sequence, that well-practiced dance of, okay, well, you've done this, so we're going to calibrate our response. We're going to do this. And there are reports of Hezbollah military bases across the kind of border there with Israel, emptying out some of their stocks in preparation for an Israeli response that is probably fairly predictable. They won't know when and where, but they'll have a sense of what they're going to attack. What makes this interesting to me, and to move from that, again, you're right, you framed it correctly. If it was just that, okay, it's been threatening to kick off for a while. What makes it more interesting to me is I can't really get a grip on what Israel's trying to achieve with this, the assassination in Tehran, with announcing also that they had actually killed Mohammed Daif, the one of the senior Hamas militants last month. We had speculated that it was him. They confirmed it was. So in a week, they've kind of just smash the news cycle with, hey, we're coming at you, we're getting your top leaders. They've killed something like 20 senior commanders of Hezbollah in Lebanon. So I maybe you can shed light on this. Are they trying to draw Iran, obviously the backer of both Hezbollah and Hamas, are they trying to draw Iran into a active hot conflict, or are they just being opportunistic and sort of saying, hey, how often are we going to have over the next 10, 15, 20 years a chance to wipe these guys off the map, because once things settle down, presumably maybe after the US election or at some point in the nearish future, that opportunity is going to be gone. So we've got to make hay while the sun shines. What do you think's going on?
Well, the first thing I want to say here is that I wasn't super surprised at the domestic problems in Israel. I don't want to go Old Testament on you here, John, but there's a reason that there have been so few Jewish polities in the land that is Palestine over history, and it's not always because of foreign invaders. It's usually because the Israelites or the Jews start fighting each other. I mean, people think about the Davidic monarchy. There were two different monarchies. They were fighting each other. It was the 10 tribes in the north and the two tribes around the Davidic monarchy in the south. And that's what allows the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians to come through and wipe everything out. So in Israel, it sort of shares this with the United States. Like, its biggest enemy is itself. And if it's divided in on itself, you're going to get these opportunistic attacks from everywhere. The other thing is, I don't think their strategy makes sense right now. I think it's all tactical. It strikes me that maybe these strategists, it's almost like the country's in a collective post-traumatic stress disorder. Like, they have to punish Hamas. They have to have revenge. It doesn't matter that they just made a martyr out of the guy, and that whoever's going to take over is going to be even more radical and is going to say, hey, we're winning. We're goading them into this. By killing him on Iranian soil, you're just ensuring exactly what we saw a month or two ago. So I'm expecting an attack on Israel from Iran, which, okay, great. Your missile defense shot it down at huge relative cost. It cost you how many millions of dollars to shoot them down versus how little it cost them to fire off some rockets to scare the crap out of your society and move everything. And meanwhile, you're ignoring the big threat, which is Turkey in the long run, and ignoring that you're just giving all of these enemies around you all the reason to gang up on you and to join hands and to say, all right, well, we're going to resist these Israelis who don't seem to respect the rules at any point. Maybe, the fact that they have a nuclear deterrent makes them a little tougher than they would otherwise be because they have that in their back pocket. But like, if they didn't have a nuclear deterrent, like, I think you'd be really, really scared that you could get an alliance of countries that would go after them. So I think it's really short-sighted thinking, and I think it underscores just how much sort of Israel's strategic position has weakened here in previous years, and that the more they try to show off the muscles, the more convinced I am that they're fundamentally weak.
Yeah, there's not much to disagree with there. I found it interesting too that, and symbolic that that the Hamas political leader Haniyeh was in Tehran to attend the inauguration of the new Iranian president, who, again, used the word reformist very loosely here, but is less radical than Raisi, who was killed, not that long ago. So, what does it say to a country, to Iran, to the supreme leader, and just to ordinary Iranians who may be sick of all of this as well, that, when we do elect a reformist, a more moderate voice, Israel, embarrasses them by attacking someone at his inauguration when he's a guest of the state. Now, I saw on Twitter X, excuse me, that bastion of wonderful analysis, that exactly what you said, which is Israel is scoring tactical victories. It's knocking a couple of folks off the map. It is losing the strategy. It is losing the war. It's winning battles, losing the war. And I find it hard to come to any other conclusion. The only thing I have heard that is, I think, a little bit too high level strategy, but it's that Israel is worried about losing US support post November election, and it is trying to escalate to ensure that the US can't separate itself. There is a school of thought that if Harris is elected, or even if Trump, to some extent, that there will be more separation between US and Israeli foreign policy or security policy if the war goes on. And this is a last-ditch pitch to sort of keep, bear hug them together. I'm a little skeptical of that. But before we wrap up this topic, talk a bit more about Turkey, because I think you're absolutely right in pointing out that the big thing that doesn't get a lot of reporting, but those are kind of incendiary comments from Erdogan, really, aren't they?
They are, and he does like to run his mouth. I'm not suggesting that Turkey's going to invade anytime soon, but Turkey is the regional hegemon here, and Turkey's a rising power. It's been defanged since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and its loss in World War I, but it's coming back. And you can see that where they're building military bases, where they're building diplomatic relations, the way they're trying to position themselves as a leader of the Sunni Muslim world, the way that they're stealing market share from European companies on manufacturing, the way that they are playing both sides of the Russia-Ukraine war. I mean, they're at the center of everything. And there is a reason that the countries that have controlled what used to be Constantinople and today is Istanbul have always generally had very strong countries that morph into empires. And that's exactly what Erdogan wants. I think that's what he sees for Turkey in the long run. And if you want that, you want to control that bridgehead around what is today Israel and Palestine. That's sort of the key thing you need to get into the Levant, to become that Mediterranean power and be powerful. So it's just that the writing is on the wall for me, and it's been on the wall for me for years. Iran is not the big threat. It's what Bibi uses to stay in office. But the big threat in the long run, it's Turkey. And it's the one that doesn't get as much play because it's not, threatening the big and little Satan with nuclear weapons and everything. They like to be quiet. But if Erdogan is saying this stuff out loud, I'm sure he has a reason to do it.
All right. Well, on that somewhat apocalyptic note, we're going to wrap up very quickly with a new segment we're trying out called The Most Important Story No One Gives a Shit About. That name is, we're workshopping that name. We'll see if that sticks. Jacob, I'm going to let you cook on this one. It's not very diplomatic, but I'm trying to leave my past career behind me. I'm going to let you cook on this one, Jacob. What's going on that matters that no one cares about?
Yeah, so what happened is that Angola announced that it's mediated a 2-week ceasefire between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. The DRC, by the way, says that it's an indefinite ceasefire. I haven't seen anything out of Rwanda. Angola in the past has been on the DRC side. The ceasefire is not supposed to take effect till August 4th. Like, take it all with a big grain of salt. But what's been happening is that in the eastern parts of the DRC, which is where a lot of the world's cobalt is located, there's also heavy copper mining, gold mining, all sorts of really important minerals that Elon needs to make all of his EVs. There's been a lot of fighting, and there's been a lot of death. There have been tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people displaced. It's something that I'm sort of always watching. It's also, if you know your history a little bit, I think a lot of people know about the Rwandan genocide. What they don't really know is the next chapter, which is the Second Congo War, or Africa's World War, which was the deadliest conflict in the world since World War II. Again, in the sort of vein that things that nobody talks about. It's estimated that over 5 million people between 1998 and 2002, 3, whatever you want to date it as, died in that conflict, which the Rwandan genocide was just one chapter on the way there. And it's something I've been focusing on for a long time because you've got these rebels in the eastern DRC who are running around doing all these sorts of things. It looks like they're backed by Rwanda. So the UN Security Council about a month ago said, yep, there are 3,000 to 4,000 Rwandan soldiers on the ground helping these rebels go after these eastern parts of the DRC. And that was really the core of that huge conflict in Africa in the late 90s and early 2000s. Angola was actually on the side of the DRC because they wanted to have their own puppet in the DRC and get access to all those mineral resources, et cetera. So maybe it's not going to become anything. Maybe it's just going to stay a low-level insurgency that's creating some migration. Maybe this is a deal that's going to lead to some sort of peace arrangement. But I think that one thing that nobody's talking about is that we're getting shades of that great African war again in general. And I, for one, am always looking out for, is their fighting increasing? Is migration increasing? Do we have somebody who's actually trying to mediate? Like, all of these things are things that are supremely important. And even as, we spent a lot of time talking about the Middle East today. I mean, just put the DRC, what's happening in Sudan, and what's been happening in Ethiopia on the board. I mean, these are conflicts that are orders of magnitude worse, just in terms of the overall loss of life. I don't like doing comparative suffering, but we don't talk about these things, even though they do have international implications for commodities. They do have international implications with migration and arms smuggling and drugs. It does have international implications when you're talking about the stain of things like the Rwandan genocide or Darfur, which is basically happening again. So I thought it was worthwhile to just say, hey, this is happening in the background, and maybe Angola has solved it for us. I sure hope so.
I only have one question because I know we're running late. Is there any international involvement in brokering this kind of not peace but ceasefire? But is there any sense that China is on the ground? Because I know they've been trying to get involved in that area for a while, or the US or any other European powers, or is this something that they've just come to terms with themselves and are trying to solve it for themselves?
I think all of these different countries have different interests. So you've probably seen, Russia and the Wagner Group is running around different parts of sub-Saharan Africa trying to not capture different governments that are weak, but make Wagner and their mercenaries indispensable to some of those countries.
Mm-hmm.
China cares more about the minerals than anything else. So they are actually working with the DRC government to get the cobalt and the copper and the tin and everything out. So they're only going to be they're only going to be angry if the flow of those mineral commodities shuts down, and the fighting hasn't caused that yet. The United States is there in the background releasing statements. But that's not what's going to solve things on the ground. What's actually going to solve things on the ground is, well, what is Rwanda going to do, and what is Congo going to do, and what are all these countries that are around them? What are their incentives, and who are they going to support? And what are the political processes look like in these parts of the world? That the UN went after Rwanda in that way and put out that report that there are Rwandan soldiers on the ground. I think that's the international community trying to tell you that they want some attention here. But I think too often the story with sub-Saharan Africa is if these countries are getting what they want, whether it's political influence or their minerals or, the statements that they're doing something or US aid, flowing into the country, they're usually quiet about it. So I guess I would also just say, if you do your history, the Vietnam War ended up being the big sort of American mistake in the context of the Cold War, but it very easily could have been Congo. I mean, if you go back to the assassination of Patrice Lumumba and the CIA on the ground in Congo and what the Soviets were doing there, like these parts of the world, when you're in these multipolar environments where the great Olympian powers are competing against each other, this is usually where the pawns are being moved, and the pawns are being moved and they're dying, and it's really sad and depressing.
Well, on that note, Jacob, thank you for joining me this week. We'll be back next week with, who knows, hopefully something other than Middle East or a US election, but unlikely. Thanks again.